This is our first Climate Action Plan public engagement session. My name is Mike Lieber, and I'm a senior planner with the town of Southampton. I have with me Janice Scherer, head of land management, Councilman Bouvier, one of our strongest champions when it comes to pursuing this, as well as Emery Lee from Ramble and her team. Emery, if you'd like to introduce yourself and your team.
Sure. I will just do some quick introductions and then go ahead and pull up our slide deck because we do have an intro slide in the presentation. So yeah, thank you, Mike. My name's Emery Lee. I am with Ramble. I am the Climate Adaptation and Resilience Lead for Ramble in the Northeast. I'm based in New York and I work on climate action and adaptation projects in the region. And I have with me Melody Redburn and Shelby Smith. I can let each of them introduce themselves. Melody?
Sure. Hi, my name is Melody Redburn. I'm a manager in our sustainability group. I'm based in Denver, Colorado. I focus a lot on greenhouse gas inventories and greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies. So I'll be reviewing the town's greenhouse gas emissions and then reduction strategies we've developed for the Climate Action Plan today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shelby Smith. I'm a senior planner with Ramble out of the New York City office. I'm working closely with Emery. I work within the resiliency and adaptation water group, so a lot of kind of sustainable integrations and long-term resiliency planning.
Well, we're so glad to have all three of you with us. And just before we begin, Charles, if you could maybe open up the closed captioning so that people can see one's questions. And I know Southampton High School is in attendance via Jen Keller, so a little shout out to them. Councilman Bouvier, is there anything you'd like to say before we begin?
Well, I wasn't prepared to speak, but I just welcome this issue, and I really, it's been a pleasure working with Rambo, and you know, we're looking for solutions to try to meet our carbon emissions goals, and this is a really big step, and I'm very excited to hear what they have to say. One of the steps, obviously, is to reach out to the public in general. So I think this format is good to do that, and let's get going.
And before we do, Janice, do you have anything you'd like to say before we begin?
Sorry, I was muted. Just welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have this time to really drill down on what we're doing for our steps to take that we can for climate, what we can do, measurable actions, and we're really pleased to have Ramble lead us through this. So I'm excited to see where this takes us. Thank you very much.
All right, with that, Emery, I'm going to hand it over to you and let you do what you do best.
Terrific. Thanks, Mike. Just going to share my screen here. So one moment. Okay. Is this coming through for everyone?
It is, although it's on the presentation format in the slideshow. There you go. Now you're good to go.
Okay. Wonderful. So, yeah, welcome everyone. Today we're going to provide a summary and overview of the work we've done to date for the Town of Southampton Climate Action Plan. So here's the agenda. Pretty brief, but you know, I think we'll be able to cover a lot of ground. We have been working on this very hard, so we're excited to share this with everybody. So starting with the team introduction, you heard from each of us just a second ago, but here are our headshots. And yeah, we've like I said, been working on this with Mike and others at the town. So very excited to finally be at the point where we can engage with the public and collect some feedback and dialogue on the goals of the plan. So a little bit about our project process. I'm going to try to move this down and see if I can, so the goal was to create a climate action plan and energy blueprint to guide the town toward achieving its climate action or climate related goals, which are, 100% renewable energy by 2025 and 100% carbon neutrality or carbon neutral by 2040. And, a key piece of building that roadmap is, getting a handle on greenhouse gas emissions. So developing an emissions inventory. So understanding, where the town is today in terms of carbon emissions, and then forecasting in the future a business as usual scenario. And then also sort of forecasting a scenario where the town takes deploys certain strategies and actions to reduce emissions and shrink the carbon footprint, so to speak. So, now we're at the point of engaging the public. And as Mike said, this is the first of public meeting of the sort of series of engagement that we plan to do. The end product will be a climate action plan report that, is very streamlined, digestible, easy to understand. So it's something you could pick up and read, get a cup of coffee and put your feet up and read, and then something that actually the town will use in the coming years to take real steps towards reducing emissions. So an actionable plan. We're excited to kind of share the substance of that as part of the technical presentation. Again, here's a little bit about just the process generally. Sometimes a visual helps. Again, started by creating the emissions inventory, did some research on the best ways to engage the public. So what methods, could we deploy to reach the broadest audience? Coming up with emissions strategies based on, what we learned from the emissions inventory, and then also factoring in potential carbon sequestration and offset solutions. So how can that contribute to reducing the emissions for the town, and then calculating financial and economic impacts of the emissions reduction strategies. So then obviously, going through some town board work sessions and public hearings to ultimately, have a final plan in hand that can be adopted and then acted upon. With that, let's get started on the technical presentation portion of the conversation. I'm going to turn it over to Melody Redburn to sort of walk everyone through sort of the analysis of the emissions.
Great, thanks, Emery. We went through this briefly on the previous slide just as part of the plan process, but really this is kind of the buildup on how we identify the ways and the strategy for the town reaching their carbon neutral goal. So the first step in that process is to really understand what are the town's greenhouse gas emissions. We select a base year in order to calculate those emissions against, to understand kind of where we're starting from. So we'll review that emissions inventory. From there, we also build an emissions forecast to understand where the emissions could go without any action. This helps inform the specific actions and the areas of emissions that need to be reduced. Then we start to set climate action priorities. So these are larger buckets. You can kind of think of these like almost like the chapters of the plan. And then within that are specific strategies for reducing those emissions. And so we'll walk through what some of those look like. This is also at the level where we start to model what the expected or what the anticipated emissions reductions will be associated with those categories based on a series of assumptions. We put all of this together to show the overall emissions reduction impacts and understand where the town is headed in terms of its emissions and where there's still a little room for more action and those additional measures. So this is just kind of the overview of the technical material we'll be walking through today. Next slide, please, Emery. Great. All right. Well, starting with the base year greenhouse gas inventory, The town of Southampton selected 2019 as the base year. This is largely due to data availability and also avoiding the impacts of the pandemic that were quite atypical in 2020 and even into 2021. We started developing the inventory in 2022 and therefore did not have a full year of data to understand what those emissions were for 2022. So looking back to 2019, which is, as we all know, over the last several years is probably the last time we had a quote unquote normal year. So we use that to kind of measure against going forward. The greenhouse gas inventory is developed using the greenhouse gas protocol for community scale inventories, along with the city inventory reporting and information systems tool. This standard is the globally accepted standard for developing greenhouse gas inventories, and it provides a consistent approach for accounting for emissions. The community scale guidance specifically provides information for determining the emissions boundary, the scopes of emissions, and the calculation methods for community-wide greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see here in the chart shown on the right of your screen, the major emission sources. The total emissions for the town of Southampton in 2019 were about 770,000, a little over 770,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. The smallest source of these is waste. This includes both solid waste that is sent to the landfill as well as emissions associated with wastewater treatment. The next category is transportation. This includes fuel use, including gasoline and diesel, associated with on-road vehicles, rail, and marine transportation. And then energy use is by far the largest category. You can see those broken out by residential energy and commercial energy. Both of these energy categories include electricity, fuel oil, and natural gas. You can see for both the residential and commercial sectors that electricity is by far the largest source of emissions. 74% of residential energy emissions come from electricity, and for commercial energy, that's 79% of those emissions. Based on the town of Southampton's population, this is about equivalent to 13.3 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per capita. This is very similar to other Long Island communities and throughout the region. So very average, honestly, for what the emissions we would expect for a town the size of Southampton. Next slide, please. As part of the emissions inventory, we also looked at the town operations, so the government facilities and operations that the town owns and operates, also for 2019. The total emissions for these town operations were 4,700 metric tons carbon dioxide equivalent. So that is obviously a pretty small portion of the community-wide emissions, less than 1%. The largest source of emissions is the fuel use associated with vehicles and equipment. There's a wide variety of vehicles and equipment to serve the community, and so this is largely what accounts for most of the town's emissions. It's important for the town to measure its emissions for its own operations, even though it is a small percentage, in order to measure, track, and then take action to set an example for the community. I see some questions in the chat. Emery, do you want me to go ahead and answer those as we're going or come back to them?
Mike, do you have a preference?
Melody, if it adds to the conversation, you're welcome to answer them as,
okay,
but whatever you like.
Sure. There was a question on the pie chart for the back 2 slides, Emery, on the base year inventory. Yes, fantastic. So the question was, how do the 74% electricity for residential compare to the 79% for commercial? The 74% is, so it would be 74% of that 49% on that residential energy wedge. I don't have the exact number at my fingertips. I can probably get to that fairly quickly. For residential electricity, this was about 282,000 metric tons. Likely there's a rounding error because we're not showing all the decimal places if they're not adding up related to that. We do not include private jets and helicopters in the inventory at this time due to lack of available data. So just based on where the inventory is drawn.
In the interest of moving the presentation forward, as I watch the questions come in, let's keep moving, Melody, and we'll circle back to these. Sorry, everyone.
All right, so moving into this next slide, we're looking here at the greenhouse gas forecast through 2040. So for greenhouse gas emissions forecasting, we look at what we call a business as usual scenario. This considers no climate actions taken by the town. So none of the strategies that we've identified for the climate action plan are accounted for in this forecasting. It does, however, include assumptions on changes to the electricity supply that is provided by the electric utility. This is largely, while the town can have some influence here, this is largely a market influence, which is why it's incorporated into this forecast. You can see here that as the electricity grid gets cleaner over time, you see that pretty significant reduction in the building's energy use. So the dark green and the dark blue portions of that wedge there. The forecast is based on the population growth of the town through 2040. This is assuming a change of 0.3% per year based off of census data. Largely, you can see here that even though the town is expected to continue to grow over time, over the next 20 years here, the decarbonization of the electric grid and the reduction in those emissions has more impact than that growth does over time. One thing to note on the assumptions for the electricity supply, here you can see in the bullets, we've assumed a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 and a 75% reduction in emissions by 2040. This is less aggressive than what the utility has publicly committed to, just to account for some of the challenges that the utility may have in achieving their goals. And we also want the town to continue to spur action and additional renewable electricity within the town itself. Next slide, please. All right, next we worked with the town to identify climate action priority areas. So these are what I would call kind of the large buckets of strategies that were developed, again, kind of like those chapters that you'll see in the climate action plan. These were largely related to both the emissions, but also activities that will additionally contribute to emissions reductions. So for example, sustainable design and land use planning has impacts on buildings and transportation, materials and waste. So it's kind of a cross-cutting priority area there. So we've got 7 key climate action priorities, and we'll dig into these in a little bit more detail in the next slide. Here you'll see those climate action priorities across the top of the screen. And then under each of those are the strategies that were identified in order to reduce emissions associated with either the town operations, so again, specifically the town-owned buildings and vehicles and infrastructure, or at the community scale. So largely considering how, for example, energy efficient buildings in the community are, or how additional renewable energy is added to the town electricity supply, also looking at transportation. I'm not going to go, read each and every one of these. We've got some examples for the climate action priorities that we'll walk through briefly here, but I'll pause for just a few seconds to let folks read through those briefly before we move on. I will note also the capacity building climate priority area is largely considered kind of an enabling function to help support a lot of these other strategies. Next slide, please, Emery. All right. So for each of these priority areas and major strategies, we identified and developed key assumptions that went into the projected emissions reductions associated with each of those climate action priorities. So here is showing the expected reductions by 2040 based off of priority area. On the far left in the dark blue, those are the 2019 baseline emissions. So again, that's 770,200 metric tons. The next light green bar there you see as a reduction in those emissions. This is what is attributable to the grid decarbonization based off of the previously stated assumptions. So 75% reduction in emissions by 2040. The buildings sector is next. So the dark green bars you see there are the climate action priority areas that have emissions reductions associated with them. The buildings climate action priority area focuses heavily on energy efficiency in existing buildings, and then eliminating and reducing the use of fossil fuel in new buildings to really reduce those emissions. Clean energy focuses on solar installations across all sectors, residential, commercial, and also at town facilities. It also looks at district energy systems and the reduction and elimination of fossil fuels to get to entirely fossil-free clean energy sources. The next climate action priority area is transportation. This focuses on the electrification of vehicles, largely attributable to kind of market shifts in electric vehicles and where those are expected to head. I think there was a question in the chat related to this. We model this as a strategy rather than in the business as usual forecast. The next category is land use planning. So it looks at transit-oriented design and also ways to continue to reduce transportation. So, adding more sidewalks, adding more bike lanes, and some of that overlays with the transportation area as well. Then we look at materials and waste. This is primarily composting rather than sending organic waste to the landfill. Carbon sequestration is the last climate action priority area. This looks at the availability of forests, wetlands, grasslands, and their ability to remove and sequester carbon. Finally, the blue bar there at the end is the expected remaining emissions that will need to be reduced. However, we expect that carbon sequestration will additionally contribute to this with more aggressive strategies, as well as just changes in technology over time. I think we've all seen how fast technology has changed in the last 5 to 10 years. So there's a lot expected to continue changing that is just not able to be modeled at this time. Next slide, please. Another little bit deeper note on the role of carbon sequestration and removal. This can provide Southampton with additional emissions reduction measures with very focused kind of concerted efforts through preservation and really just concerted effort on utilizing those restoration areas to result in carbon sequestration. The focus areas here include forested land, wetlands, and then grasslands in particular. We did use conservative estimates. The expected emissions removal and sequestration associated with each of these focus areas can vary pretty widely depending on the level of restoration, and also the carbon accounting methodologies that are used to account for that sequestration. So we did use a conservative estimate just to be on the safe side there. I would also like to note that climate change can continue to impact these areas and available restoration area over time. So also why we use the conservative estimates in case those areas are impacted between now and 2040. Next, we wanted to talk a little bit within each of these climate action priority areas about examples of community actions and ways that the residents and businesses of the town can really help support the climate action plan. So in the buildings area, two of the primary strategies that relate to the community are looking at sustainable retrofits to existing commercial buildings. So in this area, some examples of community action include pursuing green building pathways, both for residences, but there's also options at the commercial scale as well. Looking at utility rebate programs, along with selecting the most efficient options when changing out equipment. And those utility rebate programs can often help offset the costs of those if needed. New York also has a really great property assessed clean energy benefit financing program. So this looks at helping to finance energy efficiency retrofits or adding renewable energy. And rather than paying for it upfront, it can go through your property tax assessments. The next strategy is looking at new construction. So this again is focused on those new additional buildings that will come in, and it's very important to look at the energy efficiency and also the types of energy that are used in those buildings. So pursuing green building pathways for new builds. This can also include implementing very energy efficient equipment, also looking at reducing or eliminating the use of fossil fuels in those buildings. And again, there can be state and utility incentives for this as well. Next slide. Oh, thanks. This climate action priority area is the clean energy. This focuses on increasing low carbon and renewable energy generation in residential and commercial sectors. So of course, installing solar is a great way to do this. Other methods are also looking at heat pumps to replace especially fuel oil and propane, but also natural gas furnaces as the technology continues to develop. There are today readily available cold climate heat pumps that can be used in colder areas. I know that's often a concern in the Northeast just with the climate there. So that technology, again, has changed significantly just in the last handful of years, and those are ready and on the market now. Other ways to increase low carbon and renewable energy generation if on-site solar is not a viable option is to look at utility green power programs as well. The next climate action priority area is transportation. So this looks at sustainable transportation throughout the community. This can include everything from converting your own transportation to alternative options, so electric vehicles or commuting, increasing bike use, things like that. Also installing and developing out the charger network for electric vehicles. We know that now that electric vehicles are readily available on the market, but charging stations are certainly lacking. And so if you're a business owner, this is one way that would spur some of that sustainable transportation. And there are a lot of incentives available coming through some of the federal and even state policy for that. Another way is to work with the town to identify locations for increased alternative transportation options, especially at the neighborhood level. If you know of good areas or places that see a lot of bike traffic, for example, but don't have great bike lanes, that's an option to have the town work with the town to work on adding those. Materials and waste. The strategy here is focusing on waste reduction and circular solutions. So this focuses really on getting waste out of the landfill primarily. So this includes practicing good recycling practices, understand what can and cannot be recycled by your provider to reduce contamination in those recyclables so they don't end up in the landfill. And also increasing composting. So whether that's in your own home and backyard or participating in town composting events when available. And then also looking at just reducing use of materials and waste through buying used. Buy nothing groups are rapidly increasing kind of across a variety of communities as an option. Utilizing reusable containers, again, just in an effort to keep things out of the landfill. We've talked a little bit more in depth here about carbon sequestration and removal. Again, quantifying and expanding natural resources, habitats, and trees. Ways that the community can really support this is to just practice good stewardship of public and open lands, of those existing lands, so that they don't get degraded through public use. So this can include practicing leave no trace principles, staying on designated trails, reducing waste in waterways. This seems like a very simple thing, but it's really important for preserving these lands, and as additional areas are considered under restoration or preservation, to continue to work there. Utilizing native plants and landscaping at your home or business is also another great way to add additional carbon sequestration and reduce other resources that way, and participating in local conservation efforts. Finally, for capacity building, again, spoke a little bit earlier to this one, does not necessarily have direct emissions reductions. However, it's really critical and important to help promote and really stand up these strategies in the climate action plan. So the town is committed to increasing industry and community education and training. So the community action here is to really just participate in those town public processes and educational opportunities, particularly things like this meeting, to ask questions and to voice your thoughts on the climate action priorities, and also invite your friends and neighbors. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Emery.
Thanks, Melody. Yeah, just a little bit about next steps. For us anyway, our task is to collect feedback from everyone here tonight and incorporate it into the climate action priorities, strategies, and actions. So the existing body of work. We are going to complete the financial impacts analysis for the emissions reduction strategies and actions. So we'll end up with a sense of not only the magnitude of emissions reduction impacts for the various climate actions, but also the financial and economic, impacts as well for each of those types of strategies and actions. And also drafting the actual climate action plan report. So putting this all down, pen to paper, getting the numbers and the data into a document that we will continue presenting sort of drafts of through the spring of 2023, and then ultimately have a draft ready for this summer for to go through the public hearing process. So that sort of sums up just what's in front of us for the next couple months. And now I think we want to go ahead and open it up to questions. Mike, would you like me to, I know you can sort of.
It's up to you. I mean, we could start at the top and read down the list, or we could open it up to let people with their hands, we can hear from them verbally and kind of break it up a little bit. Yeah. Go read from the chat box as well.
Sure. So. Yeah. I mean, I thought these were going to be for prompts, but maybe we don't even need the prompts, because I can see in the chat box, I'm just screen sharing, so I haven't looked, that there are quite a few questions. So maybe we should start with those. What do you think?
You know what? Since there's one hand up, let's give Tip Rowland an opportunity to ask questions. He's been quite engaged. He's from a member of the Green Committee.
Perfect.
Coming in.
Thanks, Charles.
You want to keep the share up?
Oh yeah, should I go ahead and take that down maybe?
You might end up referencing it if there's questions on specific
Okay.
slides.
Okay.
Tip, do we have you yet? Tip, you have to unmute yourself. Hey, Tip, glad to have you. Just you got to unmute yourself so we can hear your question. Sorry to pester you.
Okay, is that okay?
Go ahead.
Okay. My question was really about the way the presentation came across. I was very impressed, by the way. I'm sure you're doing great work. The initial reading implies that electricity and fuel oil are sort of equal as to the ability to influence them. And of course, whether you heat your house with fuel oil or electricity is your decision. How our electricity is generated is not. Hopefully it will be one day, but at the moment, we're entirely dependent on light bulbs. So when the statement is made at the beginning of the presentation that electricity is the worst offender, whereas later in the presentation, you quite sensibly recommend that we switch to electricity. I understand why you said it, but to the observer at the beginning of the presentation who doesn't know what's coming later, it's confusing because we've mixed up here the things we can control with the things that we can't. So I think perhaps some kind of clarification with that initial statement might be helpful to the understanding by the public. That's it, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you, Tip. Emery, I'll let you field this one.
Sure, yeah. I think perhaps maybe you might be referring to the slide on the 2019 base year emissions where it was residential and commercial broken down. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes.
Melody, do you want to revisit just, that slide, comment on sort of what it was showing? I know it was showing the breakdown, right, of like residential and commercial consumption, right? And the distinction with the sort of fossil fuel driven piece of it.
Yeah, I think the discrepancy may be coming because electricity is used in every home and business, right? Whereas heating may come from natural gas, it may come from fuel oil, it may come from propane. So those overall percentages are less for the heating sources, whereas electricity makes up a much larger component of that because it applies everywhere. The difference is also in the emissions that are associated with that electricity or fuel oil or natural gas, for example. So it's entirely based off of the consumption that is used, and that consumption we received from the utility providers, whether that's the electric utility or gas or estimated uses. And so that's why the percentage changes.
I understand that. If I were to look at that slide at the beginning of the presentation and not read the rest, I would consider that the best thing I can do to restrict emissions is to reduce my electricity use. And yet later in the presentation, you quite point out that you really want more electricity use and things like heat pumps, because that will eventually become, hopefully, a carbon-free source.
Yeah.
That's not clear from the beginning. And that's my point.
Well, thank you, Tip. I think when we go a little bit more in detail as time goes on, we get more information, we can make that a little bit more clear. All right, Tip. We're going to move on to Lynn Arthur. We're going to try to restrict this to 1 or 2 questions per person so we can actually get through everything. I want to feel like everyone's heard. Lynn, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I just want to piggyback. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I want to piggyback on Tip's remarks. I agree with his observation. Something that's happening very recently is that we had a work session with the town board, and we're on a path we're right now in the outreach period for a CCA program. It's a 60-day outreach, and then after 60 days, the board will decide whether or not to move forward and issue an RFP for power supply. If that happens, the current schedule calls for that RFP to be issued on June the 10th. So if it makes sense, what I'd like to see in that you guys consider, what would be the impact? Is that if we're able to get a proposal, we're pretty confident we will, but if we're able to get a proposal for 100% renewable at the same price or less, how would that benefit the numbers? And I'll just leave it there. That's all I wanted to say. I don't know that that's a question, but I'd ask that you consider that if it makes sense.
Comments are valuable. Thank you, Lynn. So do we have anyone else next to come in, Charles, or should we start reading down the list? All right, 2 hands up, 3 hands up. So,
Paul's coming.
Okay, great. And everyone just keep in mind, we are taking notes. We plan on incorporating these comments in any way possible. Okay, Paul?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I can't seem to get my video up, but 2 things. One, it wasn't clear to me when you talked about projections, we talked about population growth and things like that. Some of the nomenclature or some of the sources for that I was not familiar with or didn't really understand. So I just think a little more clarity on when you say we're basing this work on a projection over the next period on such things as population growth development in Southampton. I think what the source of that would be really helpful. And that was the main thing. Yes. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Melody, I know you've taken a long look at the data and where we're getting.
Yeah, and I think we can definitely include that, excuse me, especially in the narrative of the plan. It's largely based on census projections that we received from the county. But we can, be sure to include those data sources a little more explicitly.
Could I follow up a question on that?
Sure.
Well, I mean, I guess the reason I got concerned is that there was no way in the world we would have been able to project population growth before COVID. And that just, as all of us who live out here saw the huge influx of people. So it just seems to me that needs to be pretty well thought through, whatever the projections in whatever area it is. I think we need to really think about that, because we really did experience, as everyone else did, an enormous change in the population. So, which was in some ways climate related, if you like, but that's all.
Thank you, Paul. Okay.
Diane, you're next.
I'm sorry. Let me just make one comment. When you're finished, please mute yourself, just because I'm seeing a lot of people entering.
Trying.
I want to make sure we don't pick you up. Go ahead, Diane.
Me?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm just wondering, with the traffic that's out here now, it will increase as the years go on if we increase building, and where you think that transportation or a different route into this community or a different idea would not be considered very important, to say the least. I'm on North Main Street, and they just cleared off probably 30 acres surrounding my home. So there's no trees, there's no forest or anything, but I can see the haze now. There's like a brown haze that comes in right about, 4:30, 5 o'clock. It's sort of sad. And that's from traffic. So has anybody considered a different mode of transportation completely, or roads that go up high, or, just anything? Has anything been looked at as far as that goes?
Jazz, I see you hopping on. I'd like to speak to that.
Well, I would just say yes. I mean, alternative transportation, right? Emery, you could really speak to this, but if we don't have alternative modes of transportation, including the train, bike paths, shared mobility across the town, that's one of the biggest gauges of, a sustainable community, I would say. So I think that long-range planning absolutely has to include all of that.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on, and add to the response, the examples of actions that were shown on the slides were like more community focused, but we do have, and what will be included in the larger plan is also actions that the town can obviously take. And some of you may be aware of this already, but I know off the top of my head, one of the recommendations under the transportation climate priority area is to have a study done, a detailed feasibility study done for different types of alternative sort of public transit modes. So if it's first and last mile connections, that sort of thing. I think it was 2009, the Volpe study, but again, or 2012. It was about a decade ago or more at this point. But revisiting that kind of study for the town of Southampton, I think it was that study in particular included the East End, so the five East End towns. But yeah. So that's
the biggest thing also, Emery, and just Diane and all that, we've been working with Assemblyman Fred Thiel to really work on, the infrastructure bill and getting the railroad sidings that we need in order to get that train. That was the Volpe study was all about, being able to get the Long Island Railroad off the tracks when they're not running their 2 to 3 trains a day, and we can have more of a scoot train going back and forth between our hamlets. And that was what the Volpe study and SEEDS, Sustainable East End Development Strategies, was all about.
Yeah, and I'd also just like to add, because it's seeing the haze from the emissions of trucks and cars going by is really indicative of why we're doing this in the first place. And it's a long-term plan to move forward. And there are these technologies that are emerging. The conversion to electric cars is now upwards of 10%. And the technologies that can also support that, you've probably seen in many other cities. One I think of right away is Santa Barbara, and Chicago, interestingly, that they are really replacing their public transportation with electric vehicles. There are heavy duty machinery, vehicles, trucks and those kinds of vehicles that are now being converted to electric that are doing well. The one thing that Michael alluded to early on was that the thing that's not catching up with that is the infrastructure to support charging those cars. But there are companies like BB Pulse and others. You see some companies that are trying to convert their business model to do exactly that. That's really promising. And a big one, particularly with roads, is inductive charging. There are some places in the world, particularly in Europe, where this has been implemented successfully. So what we're trying to do here is gather the information and the input to solve that exact problem that you're experiencing by reducing that emission. That's a big sector of the emissions problem. And, it's hard, as it is hard to predict technology and its advancement and where it is. We're doing this so that we can fix that problem going forward as a long-term plan for the town. The goal is in 2040. Might not seem that far away, but technologically it's light years ahead. There's a lot of things going on. But anyway, just wanted to make that comment. Thank you. Sorry to interject.
Thank you, Councilman Booby, and thank you, Diane.
I think Tony's next.
Oh, hi, I'm Tony. First off, thank you for doing this. I grew up in Quad. My mother grew up in Southampton, and my wife and I have a home in Hampton Bays. And we're also on the board of 2030, which is about mobilizing 500 million citizens to cause a reduction in gigatons 60 in 2030 to 41. If we do that, we stay inside 2 degrees centigrade, which is livable. Anyway, I'm curious about how to stay involved with this. This is the first time I've come to it, that I've seen it. I'm excited that you're doing this. So many good questions and ideas I've already gotten in the half hour I've been on it. And including the possibility that transportation could work out on the east end and the South Shore is real, and it's urgent. I love the idea about getting more charging stations and getting what you call the Volpe plan interim trains would be enormous value. And people coming out, if there was charging and there was a big presence of electric, would go that way, including trucks. Imagine. So my question is, how do we stay involved with what's happening? And that's really the heart of it. This is a great intro as far as I'm concerned. But now what? What is a citizen who cares about?
Sure. Well, there's going to be a few opportunities to involve you. One, getting your feedback and comments now is the beginning of that, and informing you, of course. But as you're aware, we have to adopt the plan. There's a whole public process. We'll have work sessions with the town board, public hearing, and those are the times that we want to hear from you as well. That's where our elected officials want to understand how the community feels about these recommendations and how we're addressing climate change. So how do I
get, Michelangelo, is that what you go by?
Or Mike, either.
Okay. How do I get my name and email on some list to be contacted to participate?
Well, why not? I'm going to put my email in the chat, and I'll be able to follow up with you personally. And for all those of you who want to connect with me, please do so via email. And we'll start there. And I think also through the Green Committee, getting your participation in that is a really wonderful first step into really getting more involved with some of the sustainability initiatives that the town is pursuing.
Okay, so if you send me your email, I'll send you an email and just follow up.
Sounds perfect.
Okay, I'll do that today.
All right.
And feel free to reach out to my office, Tony. Feel free to reach out to my office.
Great, John. Hey, can you tell me? I'm really a rookie. What is your office? I'm sorry, I don't know anything.
I'm a councilman in the town.
Gotcha.
So you can go to the town website and you'll find Mike's address and Janice's, and you'll find all those names on there. And I would suggest that you think about visiting with us. There's a schedule for our sustainability committee, and that's a good way to see all the other. There's a lot going on. This is just one part of it, and get involved that way. So I appreciate that.
Great, John. Will do. Thank you. So Southampton, NewYork.gov. Gotcha.
Yep. SouthamptonTownNewYork.gov.
Okay, what he sent me was Mike Lee. Southampton
Town, all one word, .gov. New York.
Here you go. I apologize. I'm reading too many comments. I don't remember my own email address. Okay, so in the interest of time, Tony, I will circle back with you.
It's your name, Southampton Town.
ny.gov. ny.gov.
Southampton Town, ny.gov.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Oh,
I think Margaret is next. Margaret?
Thank you guys very much.
Oh, a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm apologize. I'm not going to go on camera. I'm actually in my bed with a cold, so please excuse me. Not COVID though. Thank you for having this. I literally just got the email about an hour ago and luckily saw it, so I was able to join, and I'm glad to hear that these initiatives are happening. My specific question, because I'm actually in the middle of preparing a presentation about battery energy storage systems for the Civic Association in Hampton Bays, which I'm a resident of. And I'm curious, where in the comprehensive plan, the Southampton Town Comprehensive Plan, does it speak to battery energy storage systems? And in the NYSERDA battery energy storage system model law on page 6, it mentions appointing a battery energy storage task force that represents all interested stakeholders and residents, businesses, not-for-profits, industry, utilities, and relevant AHJs to prepare an action plan and adopt or amend a comprehensive plan to include the battery energy storage system planning goals and actions, and develop local laws and or other regulations to ensure the orderly development of battery energy storage systems. Is there anybody who could speak to where we are in that process and what's happening? Because I know there are 2 applications before the planning board, one for Key Capture Energy on West Montauk Highway, and another called Canal Southampton on 24 North Road and 17 Larboard.
Margaret, I can answer that for you. This is Janice.
Hi, Janice.
Hi. So, NYSERDA guidelines, we did do that. Internally, we met with the fire marshal, we met with the building officials, we met with the building inspectors, we met with the industry, we met with NYSERDA. We met with many people. We had many work sessions with the town board. So we did, NYSERDA is saying, build that group, and we did that. And that's how we rolled out the battery storage code that we have. That code is, enacted. There's 2 applications, as you said. One is close to a substation and meets the standards. One is further away and is requesting deviations from the standards. We understand that people want to change the code, although we put in a lot of avoidance areas and places you can't put it. And naturally, of course, the industry doesn't want to put it too far from a substation because then it would just cost so much more money in infrastructure. And you lose energy as you're further away you get, so it doesn't entirely.
Yeah, I'm aware of the rationale for the proximity of a substation.
Yeah, so we feel confident that the code is compliant with what NYSERDA is saying. Of course, everything can always be customized even further, so we'll look to do that. But as far as we're concerned, our goals are to create local energy generation and storage so that we have, resiliency, especially east of the canal, and Lynn Arthur can speak to that as well. But our CLG goals, et cetera, were to create and promote battery storage and solar as a package sort of use, a land use, in close proximity to substations and meeting various criteria for safety and visual impacts and any other type of impact. So, we can revisit certain parameters of the code that right now, east of the canal, local generation. That's the idea to, to not have substations and more fossil fuels coming this way.
Yeah, so, no, I understand the goals. And again, I'm not against battery storage energy systems. With the research that I've done, filling in gaps with the globally in a lot of locations. But I guess going back to my question about the task force, is there a list of people who are on it and what residents are on it?
I wouldn't say there's a task force. There's a nice sort of recommendation that you can create a task force. The town board didn't create a task force.
Okay.
They tasked my office, land management, with creating a battery storage code in cooperation with the entities I named. So if the board wants to create a task force, of course, that's their, they can do that and appoint people to it. And we can go forward from there. But at this time, there is no task force in that way. I saw a couple of questions in the chat about wind energy conversion systems. Yes, those are allowed in single family residential areas. And also people can create like a solar battery situation in their own homes and isolate from the grid, although LIPA doesn't like you to do that because they don't want you to be able to come back into the grid and not be, like electrocute someone working on the line. So there's a lot of still coordination that has to happen between homeowners, wanting to go off the grid and being on the grid. Sorry. So as far as and we can work further on the battery energy storage code to figure out what it is that the concerns have not been addressed.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Janice. I think we have next Dan Welter. And I see you enjoying a car ride. Hopefully you're parked.
I am parked. Hi, everybody. Thank all of you so much for a considerable amount of work on this and a really great presentation. My understanding is that food waste is a significant contributor to global warming, and I have been following the partnership between Drawdown and Southold Town with a composting program that was a pilot project. I'm hoping that in Southampton, although we have a vibrant composting program with leaves and trees and so forth, I hope that it's being looked into to also do something with food waste. I came on late, so this may have been discussed and I missed it, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating things, but that's my question and concern.
Well, I think I can answer that, Ann. We're looking at organic waste composting as part of our transfer station. We have a pilot program that's going up within the next month or so in Hampton Bays, and to test that out, make sure that it works well. But that's a big goal. You're absolutely right. It's a huge component of emissions problems, emissions altogether, and it's also a big part of our waste stream. So it's critical that we find a better way to do that, and that's what we're doing now with some really good local people, some local groups, and so I hope to be able to report really good progress by the fall. I know Janice.
I would like to also give a shout out to the Greater Calverton Civic Association and Mark Haubner and Takwi Turchin, who are working on this very issue in Riverhead and creating a pilot program where food scraps come from residential and they're then given to farms. And it's really fantastic. And so if we can do that here in Southampton, I mean, it's great. And so Mark wrote on the chat, and we should pull Mark into helping us do the very same thing they just been, figured out for Riverhead.
Thank you, Ann. And has your question been fully answered? Cool. All right, Finny.
Hello, my name's Finny. I keep hearing that biking, we need to be biking more, and yeah, I think that's great, but I've tried biking on the big roads in Southampton town, and you can't because there are no barriers and people are speeding all the time. What are you doing to help that, to fix that? Because I've gone to the local government in my town and they said that there's no way they can ever do that. Are you doing anything to fix that?
Well, yeah. So there's a couple of ways that we're addressing this. But in the context of the climate action plan, I think there'll be general recommendations to pursue bike infrastructure, bike share programs, and promote more access to biking opportunities that are safer. In the last couple of years, we did win a grant in Hampton Bays connecting two parks, Red Creek Park and Hampton Bays, to Good Ground Park. We also launched a bike share program in Hampton Bays, Bridgehampton, and Noyak along Long Beach. So we recognize that biking is a part of the solution. So what we need to do is further understand how we can continue to really pursue that as a solution to our carbon issues. I don't know if Emery or Melody would like to speak to that a little bit in the context of the climate action plan, because I do anticipate there will be several recommendations as to the significance of biking infrastructure.
Yeah, I can take just a stab at that. So yeah, I mean, in the transportation and the sustainable design and land use climate priority areas, there are recommendations, specific recommendations for implementation of studies to build out cycling bike infrastructure that includes both bike lanes, protected bike lanes, and parking. And in addition to, expanded bike share programs. So the recommendations in the plan do speak to that. And it's recommendations to obviously to the town, for over the next, nearly 20 years for the town to really try to advance and prioritize that type of infrastructure and building that out. I think we know that due to the density, the sort of type of land uses that the town of Southampton, has, there will always be some need for, individual passenger vehicles. However, to the extent that bike infrastructure can proliferate, that's sort of the objective and the goal. And some of the recommendations in the plan really speak to that. So, anything to add, Melody, or good there? Okay.
Thank you, Emery. And Finney, I'll just say one last point. For I think a large portion of biking history, biking was seen as a way to engage with the environment and a way to stay healthy. I think only recently we've begun to recognize that biking may play a very significant role as an alternative mode of transportation in reducing carbon and getting cars off the road. So I think this is the beginning of really kind of shaping a plan around how we can incorporate biking for that purpose. But so thank you for engaging. I'm glad to see someone of your age showing up at a meeting like this. So thank you. All right, Mackie. Miss Finnerty, how are you? You're still muted if you don't know. Mackie, we can't hear you yet. You're still muted. Charles, if you can unmute her.
I can only ask.
I thought you had all the power.
If I had that much power,
And while we wait for Mackie to unmute, I will say we should all thank Charles and if Sage is working with you for setting this up and being the maestro behind the scenes.
I think Mackie is the last question here also.
Okay. I did notice some questions in the chat that maybe we would like to touch on. If anyone else would like to speak, now's a potential time to raise your hand. Especially if you had written your chat a question and we haven't addressed it, you can always chime in via the chat. Let's bring in Carla or Marianne Eddy. Well, Mackie, perhaps. She may have walked away after raising her hand.
They're coming in.
Okay, thank you. Carla, I read earlier in the chat that you have a dam that you would like to electrify or something like that. So, looking forward to hearing about this. Okay. So I see Mackie's audio is connecting. And it's muted. Carla, would you like to ask your question at this time? Also muted.
Yeah, here we
Okay,
are. Here
great.
I am.
Glad to have you.
Hi there. I really appreciate the invitation. I have a few questions. I'm obviously a real engaged person from my community. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge Councilman Bouvier's efforts to keep the CPF on its core mission of land preservation. It's really heartening to see the town council try to keep land preservation as we voted it in. So I'd like to say thank you for that, John. I also would like to comment.
Thank you, Carl. I appreciate that. Thank you.
It's a hard job you do, sir.
Sometimes, but it's also really, really rewarding. And we get a lot of stuff done. And we have some really great people that you see here in the town who just, and young Finn, who there last night, I should acknowledge him. He seems like he's got a path forward. But thank you for the comment. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and Anne as well. I know she might still be on. So my comments have to do with how does this become actionable for residential, right? Because I'm in Flanders, I have water, I have a dam. Can I put in a hydroelectric dam and power the neighborhood? You bet. Would I be allowed to? Not without a lot of changes, right? So these are the kind of things that the land use code is not ready for. And, you know, I'm right on the bay. Boy, do I get some good wind and with nor'easters. I could have a lovely windmill just like my ancestors from Holland. I know all about them. So, you know, like there are opportunities within the communities to do these things. But I have to say, you guys are really needing to look back a little bit at the Peconic Estuary Program studies and the PPP, because we don't have living shorelines and we've tried. So a lot of this is really optimistic and not congruent with the town code. So I just need to make that clear.
Carla, if I could just quickly answer that, and you definitely came to the right place, especially if you're going to talk about dams and energy with Councilman Bouvier here. So when you typically need a plan in order to justify the code amendment. So we can't just have an internal meeting and say, you know what, we should have hydroelectric dams all over the town. This is how it happens. You're actually in the process right now. So that these kind of conversations, that information is incorporated into a plan. That plan is then later used by staff like myself and Janice Scherer and Councilman Bouvier, who's not staff, but he will engage with us to sponsor a code amendment and then move it forward. And we use that plan to justify. We look at the data and we say, well, this is the support and the people are behind it. So the reason our code has lagged behind is because technology has improved. And a lot of this process takes a long time. And if I could, the sustainability plan was adopted in 2013. The game has changed in 10 years. And that's why we're revisiting that today. So I'm really glad you brought up that point, because it does kind of really in a full circle, we can begin to see what this really looks like as a process and how we end up with a town code that's updated, current, and ready to tackle some of the problems that we're currently dealing with. So thank you.
Well, and to feed back to Emery, educating the town people about what needs to happen is not a high priority. We all know this. So you're dealing with a highly educated population who wants to act. So just to make that clear.
Well, let me just quickly jump in while we're all jumping in. And I appreciate what Mike had said, because that's absolutely, this is the process to get these things done. And sometimes it seems arduous and a little nuts at times. That's the only word I can come up with, that we have to go through these processes, but it is a check and balance kind of system, and it is slow going, but I think that's really necessary. Is if you have the wrong interest pushing for something, you may not get what you think you're going to get. And I think that's really critical. You know, I keep thinking that, you know, I sit on the PEP management committee, and you know, when you see the technology and you see success and failure, and the success grows on those failures, so that's how you learn to do all the things that you're talking about, all the things that we're talking about here. You need to have that metric to work from, but you also need to have the evolution of gaining the intelligence that you were talking about, and that's really important to get to where we're going. So at times I get very frustrated, but I think, and so I know everybody does, but I think the frustration is warranted because the goal is really good. You know, and I won't take any more time. You and I can talk for hours on this, Carla. So I will.
Please. Feel free. But and to the point about the PEP, they had great intentions. Very little of what they studied and recommended was implemented, and the sense of urgency among the citizens of the town is heightened. We've waited 20 years for things like better storm drains, you know. So people are getting to that point where they're like, what can I do now to bring about, you know, because it's a global problem, think locally, right? So we're all trying to ask, you know, what do you want from us to make this happen faster? And that's part of the reason citizens are so, you know, involved now.
I would suggest that, you know, we can talk offline, but you might reach out to Joyce Novak, who's the new executive director for PEP. PEP has changed, and one of the reasons it's changed is because we finally met our obligation under the statute. The CPF statute is to also help fund the Peconic Estuary program. That's one of its big line items in the statute. Which we're now doing.
And John, we can talk offline because this is all town related. And
yeah, but I'm really glad you're so engaged. So, you know, reach out to my office and let's talk. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Marianne?
Hi. So just responding there for a moment and in some small defense of the Peconic Estuary Partnership, they have funded various rain gardens here in Sag Harbor. And even though they seem kind of low life and not very glamorous, they're one of the only effective ways of really removing nitrogen from runoff. So I'm grateful every time they give the nod to one of our grant applications. But the thing, and it's kind of continuing along this same line, but leaping back a bit to what Finney was saying, I really, and maybe I missed it. Maybe I took a little astral vacation there in your answer, Janice and Michael. But in terms of bike lanes, do we have a list of roads or streets? Do we have any kind of prioritization of how we're going to make these, corridors bike friendly? I mean, one of the scariest things I've ever done out here was ride a bike on Scuttle Hill Road, and I'll never do it again. How are we approaching that in a more tactical way? Not big line strategy, tactics. How are we making this a more bike-friendly place?
So, as someone who learned how to ride a bike on Scuttle Hill Road,
and look at you.
You don't see me biking very often. I'll say this: there was the Suffolk County Hike Bike Task Force that both Janice and I participated in pre-COVID. This did create a prioritized list of where we would want to improve or have improvements to biking infrastructure and bike routes, bike lanes, etc. As you're also probably aware, the town just recently submitted a grant in conjunction with the county as well as Trust for Public Land through, I think, the RAISE grant. That's a federal program for $5 million to do a plan. Now, so often, such as the Hike Bike Task Force, these prioritizations, these documents are not to be built necessarily. They're conceptual. You're looking at this, you're getting a high level idea of where these could be. The RAISE grant, the purpose of this bike route, and this is really to cut through the hamlets to Montauk, connecting us, is to be 90% built. So this that plan is designed to be constructed. But this is something that we've recognized as an issue. I'm sorry, Emery, to steal the mic and Melody. if you want to touch on biking as well, again. But again, you get a climate action plan that has a whole argument as to why biking is so significant in a community, then leads to the next action, which is perhaps a more detailed inventory list with the ability to actually build these locations. But we need the funding to do so. And typically, a lot of the roads that we're so concerned about aren't even town roads. So we have to coordinate with the county and coordinate with the state. It's a process. But yeah, it's terrifying. Off the record, it's terrifying. Janice, you have anything?
Also, in the past, we have had the South Fork Bikeway that they, even before my time, they tried to institute, and there was a lot of pushback because a lot of people didn't want bike lanes on their roads and various reasons. But this is 2023, and we really need this, and we need to be coordinated and comprehensive about it. So, sort of like I don't want to see a bike lane from my house is just. That's not really going to, back then maybe people were more concerned about it. Now it's a way of life. We really need bike lanes. So we have to get that back around.
The reason I reference the raised grants, it's also off the road in many instances hopefully using the utility line. So, we need that kind of spine to really build off of. And that's our hope. The first is get the plan. Second would be then go into construction. And then third would be to build off of that. But there's very much a chicken or the egg conversation. Why are we going to spend so much money? Who's going to use this? And then people say, well, we don't use it because it's not safe. So, and that's been kind of the conversation for some time now. But I think we're making some significant progress. I see Andy Morris is joining us, and another bike enthusiast, and with a bike behind him. Andy, would you like to ask your question? You're muted, Andy.
I'd like to make a suggestion about budgeting. European communities like in Denmark, they use an exact amount of percentage of the highway funds for biking every year, instead of just like what Southampton town does, look for grants or whatever money's left over. So maybe we can, if we're really serious about biking out here, we need money for it. So a percentage of the highway funds, instead of like I just said, instead of just like whatever's left over to do it, grants.
That's a fair comment. Thank you, Andy.
Yeah, and also I spoke to Mr. Fred Thiel. He told me that in regards to using the LIPA Long Island Railroad properties and any other properties, the Community Preservation Fund can be used to buy those areas for bike paths. It just can't be used for using any maintenance on them. So that's a lot of money in that Community Preservation Fund to buy properties to do a bike path.
Well, Andy, this is Councilman Boovy. Just quickly answer. With CPF, we have to have a willing seller, and that's quite often the problem with CPF. You have to have a willing seller to do that, and it becomes a negotiated price. So just, I'm happy to speak to you offline about that. Maybe there's some ways around that. Fred and I have talked about this incessantly. But you just be aware that we can't just go and buy property, and it requires a lot of, appraisals and all that kind of thing. Feel free to reach out to my office.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. CS, I see that you also joined. I'm sorry we missed you. If you'd like to ask your question or comment.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much. I'm curious why we wouldn't include private jets if we're really serious and, people are talking about the urgency about, reducing emissions, I don't know, I haven't seen the numbers, but, I would guess that the private jets and the helicopters and the yachts are big contributors. So if you're talking about taking my, little middle class, little car and a little 3-bedroom house and asking me to invest in a $50,000 electric vehicle that I don't really know the science behind how that cobalt is mined and all that, but you're not even seriously looking, you're not even including private jets and yachts and helicopters. I'm just not sure how serious we're really looking at actually doing something real. Are we talking about real data here? You're talking about, you know, reducing some number that's not a real number. I mean, I think before looking at, you know, changing middle-class people's lives, you got to look at those private jets, and you got to, I mean, let's look at real numbers here. And, you know, we're talking about New York State, you know, the goal is to reduce New York State emissions by 95%. You know, what is Southampton's contribution to that? What if we wipe out the whole town of Southampton, even the private jets, or whatever, keep the private jets, keep those guys, but wipe out all the rest of us, stop all our electricity use? What kind of dent are we going to do in that 95% reduction in New York State? I think not much. I think we middle-class people don't have a big impact on the issues of New York State. I think it's LaGuardia, JFK, you know, big industry, private jets. And let's, if we're really serious about this, let's look at real numbers here. I mean, this is a data-driven situation. Let's talk about real data.
Well, thank you, CS. Emery, can you speak to the transportation data? I don't know if we defined it just by vehicular.
I think we did, yeah, unfortunately. So, yeah, I think, you know, we would need to get that data to incorporate it into the inventory. I don't believe it was part of the original inventory. Yeah.
I'll jump in that part of it is related to how the protocol defines the calculations for a community boundary. And as far as private jets go specifically, there, to my knowledge, is not technically an airport within the city boundary, even though the nearby airports may service private jets. And so that's where the difference in the boundary gets drawn based off of the published protocols. So some of those emissions would show up in a different town's inventory. Now, you know, we do need to look at the definition as we related to on-road and marine transport and the helipad challenge.
Thank you, Melody. For those of you who are unmuted, please mute yourself because we're getting some feedback.
Yeah, but Southampton is in the town of Southampton, and there are heliports in the town of Southampton. So this is reminiscent of Davos, you know, people flying private jets. You know, I'm you know, if you're not going to include those, I'm going to start asking questions. Who runs your foundation? Is it someone who has private jets? This is insane that you couldn't include those. If you want to look,
please, we can look at Gabreski potentially for jet information, but to wrap that into who do you work for has no bearing. We are, each and every one of us is responsible for our own contribution to the climate situation. So therefore we look in our own local home, in our own building envelopes, in our then community, and then regionally, and then, you know, the whole state. So I just think that the best approach is to say the comment of you should include private jets, and us to say, we'll take a look at that.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you, CS.
You want community involvement if they agree with you and rub your back and tell you how great you are. Look, there are small middle-class families here who can't afford a Tesla. And there are billionaires who can take buses and trains just like the rest of us. But you want us to switch to buying a $50,000 car and not even look at all these private jets and helicopters.
I think it's important. Let me just add this. It's important that you recognize the jurisdiction of the town. We're not encouraging people to necessarily purchase a Tesla. We're looking at what the town uses, how we can reduce our consumption. We're looking at policies in place that we can, and programs that can support the community. So we're not disaggregating between the middle class versus other classes. This is just a comprehensive understanding of what as a municipality and as a community are we consuming? What can we produce? What can we offset? How do we fix this collectively? There's no, we work for you. I'm a public servant. So, to imply anything else is insulting. So, I think we're going to move on to the next person.
I'm making a valid point. Why are you looking at my house and my?
We're not just looking at your house. We're looking at everyone's house, including those. If you are familiar with our building code, and I'm going to just say this, our building code requires homes that are larger than 4,500 square feet to be more energy efficient than those that are under. So in certain instances, we do account for that as a municipality. But I think what you're trying to say, and you're welcome to contact me directly if you want to continue this conversation, but for the purpose of moving this forward and making sure everyone feels heard, yes, I really appreciate your comments. It's got
6 times and it was not addressed. This is not real data. If you're not including it, you're not using real data and you're not really trying to reduce emissions.
We're going to do our best to include what the data available to us, right?
This company does look at aviation. I looked up their website.
So Emery and Melody, that's a comment that we've taken into consideration, and we're going to do our best to account for that data. But as Melody pointed out, some of that's outside of our jurisdiction. But again, thank you. Scott, would you like to ask your question?
Hi. Thank you for this, and thank you for that last exchange. I thought that was helpful as well. I just wanted to state there was a letter to the editor in the Southampton Press last week talking about this issue of battery technology and the challenges around the lithium cobalt mining, and that I wrote a follow-up letter to that is out on 27 East. Hopefully it'll be in the paper itself this week as well. The prior letter to the editor had referenced a UC Davis analysis looking at the future of transportation. And I just made note that that study talked about the importance of the land use transportation connection. I think it was Janice had mentioned the SEED study a little earlier in the program and how critical that is. And this new UC Davis study was talking about the need to shift away from private passenger cars towards things like mass transit, like the Long Island Railroad and that corridor, in addition to the e-bike technology. So I think we have to at least consider the possibility that by that 2040 year, there's going to be a lot more demand for e-bikes out here, especially considering how many people are here from New York City, and that we really have to do another rethinking of that transportation infrastructure. So we have safe ways for people to be on e-bikes and hopefully safe e-bike drivers that are not creating accidents for others. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Professor Carlin. So I think we're a little over time. I think we had budgeted an hour and a half for this. I know there's a lot more questions in the chat, and I see some people in there that I wish we got to, such as Jen Keller, and I apologize for missing this, and KGB and many more. So I think we may, Jazz, I think it might be time to wrap up, and maybe this gives us, we know we should have another one of these in the future, especially as more information becomes available.
Yes, Emery and Melody, do you have any other further comments? And yeah, all this is important information. We want to gather all the data. We are data driven, but we're also trying to be action driven and just do things that make practical common sense, just for our ways of living. So I think to that, Emery and Melody, do you have anything to add?
Just that I wanted to thank everyone. I actually was very impressed by the number of participants. I was not expecting so many, so this is great. And yeah, I just want to say we appreciate all the comments, all the input. I think that the plan will be better off because everyone's voice will be taken into account. So yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Emery. Thank you, Councilman Bouvier. Thank you, Janice Scherer. And for everyone else who participated. And Charles, last but not least.
Just before we go, Jen has said, how do we provide more input? Do we have an email that we can give Mike? That, if you'd like to provide emails to Mike at mlieberman at Southampton. white.gov. Yeah, give us some, your input, and we'll take all of that into consideration. And then, as we move forward and we have more to share and more, it's an iterative process, so it's a good thing to get more input and be able to, and this will be recorded. We'll put it on our website. Right? I think so. I'll try to do
it's also on YouTube.
Oh yeah, on our YouTube channel and our website, we'll create some forum, and we'll create a repository for you to provide more input. So thank you.
So just really quickly, Mike, I just want to reiterate that this process is at the very start. The collection of data, a lot of the comments I think are really spot on. And we'll take those into consideration. I've certainly heard some interesting things today that are new to me as well. So I just want to thank Rambo for your work. It's a slow process to get there, as we all know. But I think for the most part, this is something that we need to do. We're not telling anyone what to do or buy cars or whatever. We're not doing that. This is a way for us to form a pathway forward to get to the goal that we're trying to get to. And if we don't start, who will? So. I like the idea that, we can set a model for other municipalities. I think that comment was made before. What are they doing? We are working regionally with our local East End municipalities in this same vein. And I know there's quite a few municipalities around the state of New York that are also working on this in various ways. It's just starting to roll. So thank you very much, all of you from Rambo, and thank you, Mike, and thank you, Janice, very much. Appreciate your work.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for your time.